Hello, everyone. So now I'm going to talk about the chapter on women's bodies. And just to let you know, my area of specialty is actually studying body image and disturbance and eating concerns, particularly disordered eating. So this chapter might be a little longer than some of the other ones. I tried to really restrict myself and cut stuff down, but I feel like there's a lot of really important stuff to cover here that I actually know a decent amount about. And so this might be a little bit longer than some of the other videos, for which I apologize in advance. So I really like how your book authors frame this chapter by talking about objectification sort of at the beginning and the end. Objectification is one of the theories that I have worked with continuously throughout my research career. Essentially, the idea of objectification is that women especially, although there is evidence for this in men as well as trans individuals, non-binary people, will sometimes take the outside viewer's view of themselves and they start to see their bodies and really their whole selves as just this object to be looked at. And that becomes problematic because now you're not thinking about how smart you are, how good you are at sports, other things that you can do that make you a fully fledged person. Instead, you're only thinking about your appearance and defining yourself based upon that. Women are commonly objectified through the male gaze and via media images that emphasize women's bodies. And this is not new. Art historian John Berger wrote a great book about this called Ways of Seeing, where he really focuses on this in art throughout the years. And you don't have to be male to take the male gaze. That sounds kind of weird, but like we are all just taught that this is how you look at a body. And so we're very used to it. Women's bodies are examined and evaluated by everybody. Subjectification theory was devised by Barbara Fredrickson and Tomi Ann Roberts at University of Michigan in the 1990s. And it really tried to explain why women have greater rates of certain mental health issues than men. And they looked at everything and could provide a framework that since has been tested empirically quite often and typically supported. So it emphasizes the idea of self-objectification. This is where you take that objectifying gaze of the outside world and you turn it inward and you evaluate yourself based on how well you conform to the societal standard of beauty, which the vast majority of us just can't match up to because genetically we're not supposed to, or it might be so unrealistic that even the people who should match it don't without some Photoshop help. So body dissatisfaction, so our perceptions of ourselves, our feelings, our thoughts about our bodies, our actions towards our bodies, it's so common that it's been referred to as a normative discontent. So Ruth Striegel Moore came up with that phrase back in the 80s. And almost every body image article you'll read still talks about that because it's such a brilliant way to capture the fact that pretty much every woman is dissatisfied with her body. And here are some statistics that go along with that. So 50% of 3 to 6-year-olds worry about being fat. 80% of 10-year-old girls have been on a diet. 50% of women between the ages of 18 and 25 would prefer to be run over by a truck than to be fat. And 65% would rather, 66%, would rather be mean or stupid than be fat. So there's self-objectification right there. They care more about their appearance than being kind or being intelligent. So beauty norms are shared standards for attractiveness that are held by members of a given social group. So this is typical at the society level now, but this used to be perhaps even down to the tribal or familial level. Some beauty norms are very explicit, where people are told how to look, like, this is what you do in order to look a certain way, and this is what you should do. And this might come from your parents. It might come from a member of the beauty community on YouTube, right? And I'm not knocking them. I enjoy watching them sometimes, but they all kind of tell you how to do makeup in the same way, right? So if you're not contouring the heck out of your face, then what are you even doing? Says the woman who doesn't actually wear makeup anymore. Other beauty norms are taught implicitly. They've never been clearly stated, but girls figure them out from the social learning that we talked about in the gender socialization chapter. So cues in their environment, seeing how others behave. So even if you never tell your daughter you've got to be skinny, if you're always talking about concerns about your weight and talking about how you have to watch your food and you have to exercise in order to be skinny and not talking about health, they're going to get that message. Kids are a lot smarter than we often give them credit for. There are racialized beauty standards as well. A lot of our beauty norms are rooted in racism. So colorism, for example, is a preference for lighter skin that's closer to white skin. We actually even used to talk about this as passing for white. Good hair in the Black community. Actually, there's a great documentary about this that is highly recommended. So this is hair that more closely resembles the straight, smooth texture of what we stereotypically think of as white women's hair. Clearly my hair doesn't even match that, but I know that I don't have as many struggles related to this as people in the Black community do. And then Asian American individuals report dissatisfaction with their eye shapes. And the extreme of this is that some will even undergo double eyelid surgery to make their eyelids look more like the stereotypical Western eyelids. Obviously, trans women are going to have even more issues. So their body satisfaction may be tied to their perceived sense of congruence between body presentation and gender identity. So not passing as a woman is not only not meeting the beauty standards for them, but actually can subject them to discrimination and even hate crimes. Trans women of color in particular have a very high rate of being assaulted and even murdered. It's really disturbing and very few people talk about it. And then meeting feminine beauty norms can be very expensive for trans women because they might have to undergo multiple plastic cosmetic surgeries to do this. But one thing I want to also point out is that this is also expensive for cisgender women, right? If we think about the amount of money that can be spent on makeup products and creams and manicures, pedicures. I'm doing my own manicures now during COVID, but typically I would go to a salon and pay for that, right? It's something I enjoy, it's relaxing, but like, do I need to do it? Probably not, right? Hair salon appointments. My hair appointments probably cost double what my husband's do, right? Things along those lines. Beauty norms are really sort of interesting in that how they transform over time. So symmetrical faces are rated as more attractive. So something about symmetry appeals to us. And then historically, heavier women have been seen as more beautiful. So if you look at paintings from the Renaissance, for example, you see these really curvaceous women. And in fact, that was a sign of not only beauty, but wealth, because you had to have enough money to eat too much, right, to get to that point. Whereas the average working class person couldn't get to that point. Now it's thinness, and it's the same sort of reasons, right? In order to be a very thin person in our Western culture, which has sometimes been described as a bikini store next to a McDonald's, you need to be able to afford diet products and a membership to the gym, and you need to have spare time in which to work out, which is a luxury, right? Some people in our society have to work 2-3 jobs. They don't have time to do that. There's also issues of equity in terms of access to food. So there are areas, especially of inner cities, that are what we call food deserts, where the only place you can get food might be your convenience store. There's no access to fresh produce, for example. And then beauty ideals require a nearly impossible combination. So you have to be thin and have muscle tone and also have voluptuous breasts, and some people would argue hips and rear as well. The vast majority of women can't do this. And in fact, a lot of women who might have a similar body type have difficulties. So large-breasted women who are very thin might actually have back problems because it's difficult to sustain that mass. So how do we learn about beauty norms? One of my favorite models of this is called the tripartite model of social influence. And this is also been fed into some other larger models. So Eric Stice has a great comprehensive model of how eating disorders develop, for example, that incorporates some of these ideas. So the tripartite model says that it's a combination of parents, and really it's been sort of expanded to include like all family members, peers, and again, this has been expanded to include significant others, and the media. And media is not just the print media or TV. We acknowledge that social media is a big part of this in this day and age as well. And those are the key influence on body image because of the messages we get from each place. Girls and women may engage in what's called fat talk as a result of the typically thin ideal presented in these media images, which then filters down to parents, families, and peers, right? So this is a negative way of talking about yourself and your body, often as a way of eliciting compliments. It's associated with body dissatisfaction. It's associated with a lot of negative things like poor self-esteem as well. These are things like, oh, I look so fat in this, or, oh, have you lost weight? You look really good, right? Like, did I not look good before, right? Clear instances of this in my own life that I've seen. I used to dance back in high school, and seeing a girl who was thinner than I was at the time, and I was quite slender at that time, pulling literally like essentially a piece of skin away from her body, literal skin, and being like, look at my fat roll. Just sort of computing in my head, like, how does that work, right? Like, that needs to hold in your internal organs. And then also, I had gestational diabetes, and then a really rough time after my daughter was born. And so I actually lost a drastic amount of weight during and directly after my pregnancy. And everyone was like, oh, you look so good. And I was like, this is not a good thing. I lost this because I am unhealthy, right? So the idea that thinness equates to health in our society or equates to betterness is really problematic. Now, in terms of media influence, obviously this becomes even more problematic in the day of photoshopping, body doubles. There's really unrealistic beauty norms. Like, one of my favorite quotes I've seen is the supermodel Cindy Crawford saying, I wish I looked like Cindy Crawford, because they do so much airbrushing and photoshopping even on her that the photos of her don't look like her in real life. Cultivation theory says that greater exposure to the media makes these images seem more realistic and believable. And we've certainly seen a lot of influence of that in research, and we know that more exposure to media or more like agreement with the media ideal is linked to higher levels of body dissatisfaction. An increased exposure to the media's portrayal is also related to desire for thinness, which not only goes into body dissatisfaction, but also sometimes into very dangerous disordered eating behaviors, such as not eating or eating way too much and then making yourself purge it in some way. Faceism is also a really interesting thing. So this is a tendency that pictures of men focus in more on the face, whereas pictures of women tend to focus on the whole body. So here we see an example in pictures of Lupita Nyong'o and Chadwick Boseman, where here we have a focus on her whole body, or at least, down to her legs, whereas for him, we're really more focused on his face. And this is really typical. Like, I challenge you to just look through media images and see how often this actually happens in the images that you see. It's very common. It's really interesting. Even when I was in college, we did a study where we tried to find objectified images of men and compare them to objectified images of women, and we were able to find them. This was like early 2000s. But all the images of men, even when they were showing their torsos, were very square, whereas the images of women were like this one of Lupita, where they were very elongated, long rectangles, focusing on much more of the body. So again, really interesting ways they were portrayed. The problematic issue about this is not only that we're, again, focusing more on women's bodies, but that pictures where you're focusing more on the face are associated with higher ratings of competence, intelligence, ambition, and dominance. Things that are generally seen as very positive in Western society, and things that if you are not seen as having these, can give a lot of problems. So if women are typically being seen as less competent, less intelligent, less ambitious, less dominant, that's going to continue to perpetuate the ideas that women should be in these sort of lesser roles in society. Now, the other problem about the media is that there are people we just don't see in the media, right? So fat women, older women, women with disabilities, also women of color, we typically don't see as well, or if we do, they might be displayed in a really token way. For example, it's very common for African American women to be only nominated for Academy Awards if they're playing slaves. Very problematic, right? So when fat women are portrayed, they're depicted in stigmatizing ways or the butt of a joke. You can think of this in a lot of different movies, Shallow Hal, right? Pitch Perfect with Fat Amy. So it is really problematic. Whereas fat men sometimes have this, but sometimes they're just like the average dude, right? And then people with disabilities are either portrayed on how impaired they are or how courageous they are to overcome this. Like they don't get normal storylines, right? And then again, older women not being portrayed, or when they are being airbrushed all the heck, so you don't see any of the lines on their face, right? Promotes youth as a beauty norm for women more than men. It also makes it difficult for older actresses to get hired. And older women to sustain their jobs. So this is a really important facet of like, not only is the portrayal of women difficult and problematic, but like who gets to be portrayed at all. Now, here are two more concepts that I've studied quite a bit in my research: internalization and social comparison. So internalization here, we're talking about the internalization of the media image of the appearance ideal. And in, again, Western society's case, it's typically a thin ideal, although we also see an athletic ideal, or muscular ideal, not only for men, but now more and more for women. So for years we talked about like in thin-spiration pictures for women, and now we're talking about fit-spiration. So again, going back to this ideal, that's really difficult. Now you have to be thin but also toned, right? But you can't be too buff because that's not okay. Right? Like who, what gets to decide? It's really problematic. But internalization of the appearance ideal is linked to a whole bunch of different problems, primary of which is body dissatisfaction, but also linked to disordered eating, things along those lines, not surprisingly to seeing yourself as that object, that self-objectification as well. Social comparison, again, another concept I've studied quite a bit. My dissertation focused on this. I have a meta-analysis published about this. So this is the idea that we as humans compare ourselves to other people, essentially through the social learning process we've discussed, in order to assess how we're doing and also to better ourselves. Like, oh, how is that person doing better than me? So Leon Festinger came up with this theory back in the 60s, and he said that we would do this only to better ourselves. He said, like, if social comparison ever makes us feel worse, we're just going to stop doing it. Well, modern research about social comparison related to appearance shows that that is not true at all. And in fact, even when this is damaging to women, they continually engage in it. And they just basically beat themselves up about it. And they're comparing, like Festinger also said, like, oh, we'll only compare to targets that are like a little bit better than ourselves because we think we can achieve it. Again, women are comparing themselves to these media images, which again, the vast majority of people, even the vast majority of people who are portrayed in those images can't look like, right? So this is very problematic, again, linked to body dissatisfaction. Consequences of self-objectification. It can be distracting. So one of the early studies about this showed that it can impair your ability to do things like a basic math test because you can't focus. It causes increased body surveillance, which is taking an observer's perspective when you're looking at your own body. And so you're kind of constantly monitoring your own body for issues with it. And then you might engage in behaviors to try to check those, whether those are unhealthy dieting and exercising behaviors or just like sucking in your stomach, right? I actually have a quote on my office door that's from Glamour magazine of all places that says, we believe that no woman can live life to the fullest whilst I think it's whilst sucking in her stomach. You can't, right? You're always controlling yourself. Body shame is negative emotions as a result of judging your body. So it's really linked to body dissatisfaction. And some people argue it's instead just like part of a larger construct called body image disturbance. So this is your author's way of explaining self-objectification. Other models include other variables, but I think this is a really nice, clean way to look at it. So you have experiences of being objectified, right? And these can be things like being catcalled, being told by others that you're too fat, right? People drawing attention to your appearance for various ways. And then you're going to internalize beauty norms. Your experiences of objectification can also be seeing other women objectified, whether that's in advertisements, things along those lines. So you're going to internalize the beauty norms. You're going to self-objectify, see yourself as this object. You're going to constantly surveil your own body. What can I do to fix it? You're going to realize you're just never going to match up because, again, most of the models can't. So us lay people can't. That's going to lead to this body shame. And then you're going to have these negative outcomes, decreased performance in school or on the job, depression. This doesn't totally explain the gender differences in depression, but it certainly contributes. Disordered eating. So there was one study where they looked at the theory of objectification as laid out by Fredrickson and Roberts, and they tested it empirically with disordered eating as the predicted variable. And typically when we do these types of statistical models, we might account for like 40% of the variance in that final variable. That's often pretty good. They accounted for, I believe, over 90% of the variance. So self-objectification is really explaining disordered eating. Why do we objectify women? Well, there's a couple different things. Economic reasons. The beauty industry, the diet industry, the plastic surgery industry, they make a lot of money, like multi-billions of dollars. I think it's the diet industry alone is something like $151 billion annually. That doesn't even include, again, like things like makeup. And then there's an argument, particularly initially made by Naomi Wolf, but other authors have argued this as well, that preoccupying women with focusing on these beauty norms keeps them from achieving economic and political power, or even being able to focus on that. And in fact, there is scientific empirical research that shows that even in the moment being objectified, you're less likely to want to stand up for yourself politically. There are also morality reasons. So terror management theory is the idea that anything that reminds us of our mortality needs to be managed to reduce our anxiety about death. So if we think of aging as part of the dying process, so that becomes problematic. And then objects are immortal. So if you view yourself as an object, it might reduce the morality fears or mortality fears. Menstruation is mentioned here in this chapter. It's kind of a weird place to put it. I guess it is about the body, but I feel like this would have fit better in your reproductive health chapter. That's just me. But having a period is typically viewed negatively. And women and girls are often uninformed about menstruation. They might not even learn it until they have their first period. And that's associated with more negative experiences, like even extreme experiences. Like I've heard horror stories of women being raised by fathers who, when they had their first period, their father didn't it didn't click for him what was happening, and taking the daughter to the ER, like she's hemorrhaging internally, which is traumatic in and of itself, obviously. And then the secrecy and shame around menstruation contributes to the lack of education and negative experiences. And that certainly can contribute to shame around your body. Another important concept that I've studied in my own research in the past is bodily awareness. So being aware of what you're feeling in your own body, experiences of hunger and satiety, experiences of even what emotions you're experiencing. I have some really interesting research connecting this to both self-objectification and disordered eating. And so there have been some ways that have been tried to combat that. So intuitive eating is a type of eating that's often sort of prescribed in therapy, where you learn to figure out when you're hungry and when you're full. This is really hard for us to do, actually. I've tried to do it myself. And as someone without a history of disordered eating, it's a struggle because we aren't really taught to do this in our society. Think about how many times you might have been told to clean your plate when you were a kid, or you eat because it's part of a social sanction rather than you're actually hungry. Like every time I go to the movies, I eat popcorn, whether or not I'm actually hungry. It's just a thing I do at the movies, right? Interoceptive awareness is that awareness of what's going on inside of you. And the larger concept of internal awareness generally includes emotions as well as bodily sensations. But this is actually considered part of disordered eating in general. And self-objectification is related to lower levels of interoceptive awareness and to lower levels of intuitive eating. And then again, not surprisingly, if you live in one of those food deserts, or if you and your family are food insecure, maybe due to just financial issues, homelessness, things along those lines, you have a more difficult time with interoceptive awareness and intuitive eating, because you're just going to eat when you can, right? All right, so again, this one was a little bit longer. I could just go on for hours about this because this is my area of research. If you have any questions about this, even if I'm not the instructor of your particular course, please reach out to me. My email is tmyers@bwu.edu, and I'd be glad to share any additional information or articles that I have related to this. So thanks for listening, and I hope this was helpful.